But I was eager to introduce Dr. Nancy Bertaux, the author of the chapter that we're discussing tonight, Structural Economic Change and Occupational Decline Among Black Workers in 19th-Century Cincinnati. Dr. Nancy Bertaux is a professor of economics at Xavier University, holding a PhD and MA in economics from the University of Michigan and BA in economics summa cum laude Phi Beta Kappa from Colgate University. As an undergraduate, she participated in Colgate's Washington, D.C. semester, the oldest in the nation, and an academic program on economic development in Jamaica. She has worked at the Urban Institute, the Inter-American Foundation, and the Department of Navy in Washington, D.C., and at General Electric Company here in Cincinnati. She has consulted on legal and diversity matters and has published over 30 articles in scholarly journals and a book on issues of international economic development, workforce diversity, economic thought, and economic history. Welcome, Dr. Bertaux.
Thank you so much, David. And Melanie, I have to do the Cincinnati thing. I went to Princeton High School and indeed lived in Glendale in the same general era as you. We then moved to Pennsylvania because my dad was a GE engineer, and then he was transferred to Erie, Pennsylvania when I guess I was a sophomore, but I was junior. So I was at Princeton up through my sophomore year, which would have been the early 70s. I'd have to check it out to me. And my older sister is named Michelle Bertaux. So I don't know if that rings any bells with you, because I think you're just a couple years ahead of me at Princeton. And when anybody ever asks me, this is why I think it's relevant for this session, what got you interested in diversity? I always say Princeton High School, okay? Because I was there in the years where we merged with Lincoln Heights, Sharonville, Glendale, and I was a founding member on, I don't know, there was some announcement that came up about founding the Princeton Interracial Club. So I joined that, and that really changed the course of my life and my interests. Also, while there, I joined the Explorer Scout Troop, which is a co-ed scout troop where we did the cleanup of the Little Miami River. And part of the Little Miami River that is currently designated a scenic river is done because of the activities that our scout troop organized. So, and what I'd like to say is that my most recent research interest in the area of diversity, especially racial diversity, it has to do with environmental justice and the idea that a lot of the sustainability issues facing our society and our planet are incredibly falling harder on our African American and other citizens of color. And so we really really need to pay a lot more attention to those issues. So both of them were, formed while at Princeton High School. So it's just too funny that you're a fellow Princeton. I didn't graduate from there because we moved, as I say, after my sophomore year, and I spent a year or two up in Pennsylvania. But I consider myself really a Princeton alum, even though I'm not on the grads list. So there you go. I'm gonna not say too much, except for I congratulate you on. It was like when I got this email from Melanie that they're gonna take on this like really scholarly work with all of this, like you say, data and graphs and all the rest of it, and put it in a book club. I was like, how cool is that? I mean, Cincinnati Public Library needs to pat themselves on the back. And then I thought, well, probably it's because there's so little written. That's all I could find. And I just wanted to speak to that in a serious way, because when I started my dissertation from the University of Michigan, it was on the history of 19th century workers as a whole in Cincinnati, Ohio, from 1801 to 1899. I stopped at 1900. And I did a case study, by the way, on Cincinnati public school teachers. So I did overall data, and I ended up looking at it by race, by national origin. There was a lot of issues with people of German origin at that time, and by gender. And I'm telling you, I ended up doing some further publications that looked at occupational segregation, which is basically different jobs for men and women, different jobs for basically, and in this area at that time, it was basically blacks and whites. There really weren't a lot of other ethnic groups, but I also looked at German born citizens or non-native citizens in general, which were somewhat diverse, but had a lot of Germans, a lot of Irish too. And when we looked at those occupational patterns, it was like, oh my God, like there really isn't a lot of overlap here. Like different groups are like doing different jobs. And I had some of the contemporary economists who were on my dissertation committee at the University of Michigan say straight to my face, you know what? I always wondered whether there was this wage discrimination thing. Was it real? It was really explainable by A, B, C, D, E. And when I read your dissertation, it was so pointed and so detailed. It's proof. It's just there is no other answer. Like women teachers were paid half of what men were, and they talk about it in the school board reports. Like we don't have to pay them more because all they can do is be a domestic servant or maybe a seamstress, and that's it. And guess what Black women did at that time? They were laundresses, okay, which was the worst, heaviest, most physically demanding work there was, and to a lesser extent, domestic service. And that was pretty much all I did. And, Black men were common laborers, okay? And I had an article that was published called Barbers, Servants, Teachers, and something else. So they were also barbers, which was a pretty good job at that time. And then the white men had like hundreds of categories to choose from. And it was just like, there it is, right? So this work in this chapter is really, I got interested in that, and this became an offshoot of that work in my dissertation. Similarly, my work, the second half of my dissertation is the case study on Cincinnati public school teachers. And I literally went into in the Board of Education, some of the historian or the guys that worked there, the managers had in their vault, like the old ledgers of teachers from 1820 and 1823. And I literally picked all that data off of handwritten records. And I don't know if you know this, but usually what you do with data is you take a random sample and you get all the details. I didn't do that. I was a crazy young person. I did 100% of everything because I wanted to be as accurate as possible. I didn't want anybody to say, oh no, there's really not discrimination. I'm like, this is it. To the point where when my committee looked at it, some of them were actually confused. They didn't know what to do with the statistics because usually there's these confidence intervals and so forth that you use when you have a sample. But I'm like, no, this is all the data. And I finally had to have another professor say, look, she doesn't need confidence intervals. This is the data. It is what it is. There's no error here. It's just, and so when I did the school teachers, I found literally in the reports, at the end, here's what's happening in the quote colored schools. I was like, well, that's interesting. So I got into them, and I published some work specifically on the quote colored schools of Cincinnati, and they were super fascinating because they had all Black teachers and Black principals, right? And so they were, a self-stand. Now, then here comes the real dilemma because they are fighting for integration. They're fighting for funding. They're fighting for space that's not like some unheated basement in a church, that kind of thing. But at the same time, what ultimately happens when they're integrated in the 1870s is that the system tries to take away all the Black teachers and the principals. Because and they're like, no, we don't want that, So there becomes this sort of tussle. And as what happens is the Black community demands that they keep some of these Black schools open, which they do right up for decades and decades, specifically because they're allowed to have Black teachers and principals at that school. Okay. And that's why we have Peter Clark Academy, and he's one of the Black principals. So there's a fascinating teacher history too that I think I mentioned a little bit in this chapter. So that's kind of how this work grew out of. And the other thing I would just say is that Henry Taylor was like the most awesome person to work with, because if anybody knows anything about how these edited collections go, it's usually like you're working on your own, you commit, you give the chapter, or they like proofread it or whatever, and then like that's the end of it. Oh no, not Henry. We booked, I'll bet we booked 100 hours of phone conversations, because he was up in Buffalo by then, about, what do you think about this? What about that? I have this idea about that. Does the data show that? I mean, it was really, unlike most edited volumes, I would say that whole freaking book is really co-authored by Henry. So that was really, actually, that was the first thing I ever co-authored. And I liked that experience so much that I almost have nothing that's solo authored since then. So Henry changed my life too, by just introducing me to the joys of really, working with another scholar and bouncing ideas off of each other. So with that, I'll just say, I think that the chapter speaks for itself. If you can wade through the data, it's like, the people have to deal with the opportunities that are open to them, right? And so the idea that, we can all make these choices. You can only make choices when you have those choices truly available to you in a full sense. And I think this whole book really was there to document the limited nature of the choices that the Black community was faced with, and the immense creativity and adaptiveness and resilience that they showed in the face of that, to be awesome and negotiate rivulets and side entrances and the courage that they showed. And so I think it's wonderful to see some more contemporary scholarship coming out. I will also say, and in writing the works that I did on Black Cincinnati, I always tried to work with Black authors. Another author I worked with was Michael Washington from Northern Kentucky University. He and I worked on a bunch of stuff together. And it was, literally Michael and I had a study group where we read everything that had ever been written at that time, which was probably like the late night, working on the year 2000, that featured research on Black Cincinnati. And it was sad that we could do that in a matter of, a semester or two, reading fast, but nevertheless, we read every dissertation. There were literally, almost no books at all. There have been a couple of books since, but there's still a fairly, you could read everything that's been written about Black Cincinnati in a scholarly manner. You could actually do that, which that's sad, right? Because there aren't that many subfields that you can do that. Usually there's just more than you can read. And I would also say that I'd like to give credit to Zane Miller, who's no longer with us, at the University of Cincinnati, who was a history professor, and a lot of his students did their dissertations on Black history topics, and there were others, but Zane in particular was really good at telling people, this is a great topic, you should work on this. So, so glad you guys found it. I hope you didn't fall asleep too much. It's the kind of thing you got to slap yourself upside the head a few times while you read it, make sure you don't fall asleep. But the points that it makes, I think, are pretty compelling. So that's all I'll have to say. I'm sorry I have to go in a minute, but if anybody has any opening questions before I have to go, and I hope you have a great dialogue, and feel free to email me at bertaux@xavier.edu if you want to ask any follow-up questions that I wasn't here to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Bertaux. Would you kindly put your email address in our chat so we'll have that